Continuing from last week's episode,
That in and of itself says you don't understand what a democracy is. And I think we'll talk about that probably in our next conversation. This is a good segue for us to break into the next talk. Where are our future leaders going to come from? And how do we promote a civic exercise that creates new leaders rather than have an argument, a national debate about which of the philosophical tenements we're going to follow or establish or reestablish for our nation? I'm not so sure we should be looking to the past as much as we should be looking to the future. Well, even when I'm talking about democracy, we're talking about the founders' view of the Constitution. And there is no truly erudite discussion about democracy and what it means in today's technological society.
No, there's not. And we'll pivot to the discussion of civics in just a minute, but there is no discussion. And I think, again, it goes back to the lack of education in civics, because I'm not sure that what we do in terms of educating in history is just tell a story. But I'm not sure we dive deeper into the meaning of the story.
Welcome to Peter and Phil's Courageous Conversations, a podcast addressing race relations and social issues in hopes that you'll be inspired to do the same. Now, let's begin our conversation with your hosts, Dr. Peter Weinstein and Dr. Philip Nelson.
And I think, again, it goes back to the lack of education in civics, because I'm not sure that what we do in terms of educating in history is just tell a story. But I'm not sure we dive deeper into the meaning of the story.
Well, it's kind of difficult to do that when several things prevent you from discussing the story.
Well, and why? How can we all have lived in the same country and be hearing a different story? Now, I can argue, if we want to go back to Neanderthals, and the stories were different in different communities, and everybody kind of grew up with cave paintings. But we have, in many ways, truly documented history. But it's being told differently depending upon where you live and who's governing your state.
Well, history is his story, right? The victor gets to write history.
Right.
And so let's not act as if that we have lived in a world of just the facts, ma'am. History has always been biased and has always diminished a perspective of that history. There are always 2 to 3 sides to a story. Even in the Revolutionary War, here in the United States, there's a British side to the story. There's a French side to the story. There's also a Native American side to the story that we rarely talk about. There's a colonial side to the story. We only embrace the colonial perspective. And so this is not a black or white issue here. History is confusing. But if we don't look at all the perspectives, then we run the risk of making the same mistakes all over again. And so the first part is to understand that history is complicated. And and everybody talks about it from their perspective. There's a German side to the Holocaust and there's a Jewish side to the Holocaust. And that's what allows people to this day to challenge whether the Holocaust ever occurred. There is an African-American perspective on slavery, and there's a slave owner perspective on slavery. And apparently, there's a labor perspective on slavery that says that we learn skills while being slaves, and that was good for us. I am dumbfounded by that perspective that takes freedom away from a class of people and then says, but look what we did for you. We taught you how to shoe horses and pick cotton and cook fancy meals in kitchens with Stonehurst. Now, we dragged you across the water, whipped you when you didn't do it right, but look at the skills that we then did not pay you to do once you were freed.
There are individuals who've taken the first 3 letters out of history and just focused on telling what they want in terms of a story, and taking nonfiction and making it fiction. It's interesting. The initial part of this conversation was about age and older, and old, and age, being old. And the good old days, before even you and I, there were the elders who told the stories. They were the ones who, from generation to generation, would be telling the story, most of whom were older men. And I think what's an interesting question now is, who are the elders? Who is that generation to carry the story forward?
I think it's just as interesting to ask the question, and are our elders our elders? Do they understand their role? One of the things that I have noticed, or I have come to value, is the treasure of our elders.
Yeah, I look up to you, Phil.
Thanks. That was perfect. It is our elders that have learned the lessons, that should have the wisdom to share. And as much as I am all for looking forward, the best protection against repetitive mistakes lies in the culture and wisdom of our elders. And being a throwaway society, we tend to throw away too much and do not recognize the value of our elders as we do within our individual cultures. You know, we have certain cultures that have extended appropriately a certain respect, a certain deference to the wisdom that should come with age. Now, that's not to say that every person, again, we don't want to over characterize an old person as wise. That's not to say that everybody has learned from their mistakes or even knows what their mistakes were. And it goes back to this careful preparation of an individual as a citizen or as a professional so that we can learn. Our historians are probably some of the best elders we have, those who have studied the problem, looked at how we dealt with it, analyzed the results of how we dealt with it, and then reports back to us what the pros and cons were of the, in the way we approached certain problems. But there's some nuances in all of those approaches that only our elders can share. And unfortunately, the American culture does not necessarily cherish that. We get into these arguments about whether we're going to elect a 77-year-old man or an 80-year-old man. And we're not worried about the 36-year-old man who might be up and coming and could be the next president. Again, we focus on one thing or the other. And just talking about age does not mean that you're talking about preparation.
I think that's a great place to kind of ask our listeners to think about a couple of questions. One is, what do you consider old? The other would be to go ask your children what they consider old. And I think no matter who you are, who do you look up to? Who do you seek out as the elders in your community? Like I look up to Phil. from that standpoint. But who do you look to as an elder? And I always hope that my kids look to me. I'm sure Phil does the same thing, but I think it would be interesting to start to think more about these generational changes. And because both Phil and I are in the Social Security Medicare realm, don't forget to respect your elders. So thank you, Phil. Great
Well,
conversation.
thank you, Peter. That was a good conversation, and I'm looking forward to the next to the next part of this conversation, because
Absolutely. Thank you to Nationwide. Thank you to our listeners. But please stay tuned for a conversation that's probably going to be a little bit more hot and heavy as we dive deeper into the civics of the world and elders and other things from that standpoint. But God, I'm feeling old. So thank you, Phil.
You are old. I just, take it from your elder.
Thank you for joining us for another courageous conversation. Be sure to follow us and check back next week for more.